Welcome, everybody. I'm Matt, and this is a Rising Tide talk or an RT talk. This is my first time hosting one of these, so I hope I do justice to all the previous hosts of the Rising Tide talks before me. And today we're talking with Jesse Adler. And Jesse is joining us from the Patreon Creator Partnerships team. He joined that team in 2021, and he's an experienced media professional. Jesse has spent his career on all sides of the content landscape, from traditional TV and film to digital media and podcasting. Before joining Patreon, Jesse worked at the independent podcast network called the Podglomerate, helping independent podcasters distribute their content and monetize it through new business models. Jesse has years of experience working with creators to brainstorm all kinds of new ideas to build their businesses forward, and is now working with creators to empower them using Patreon and kind of connecting fans to content creators. Jesse, welcome to the talk. Welcome to the Rising Tide community. Why don't you say a quick hello to everybody?
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, really excited to be here, talk to you all about Patreon. I think it's an amazing way to connect with your fans and help monetize. And so excited to talk to you all because, I think the tabletop role-playing space, D&D, all this kind of stuff is really awesome. So happy to help out however I can.
Cool. Yeah. Hopefully we can maybe give you some advice for your character builds too. So tonight to build yourself a really cool character.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I'm super excited to have you here tonight, Jesse. For those of you listening, I have some questions prepared to ask Jesse, and I'm going to kind of touch on three main topics. But if you feel like you have a question that's more specific, or you want to get your thinking hat on now to think of some questions moving forward, there is going to be a section of the show dedicated to the audience's questions. So please feel free to post those in the RT discussion text channel of the Discord, and we'll make sure that we get those to Jesse and we can try to have that conversation. But in general, tonight, Jesse, my plan is to talk to you kind of about three main pillars. The first is for people who maybe haven't yet made the jump to Patreon and kind of to get a sense of what that might feel like to be a Patreon creator. The second pillar is going to be about advice regarding rewards and the kind of content that people, should consider putting onto their Patreon if they have one already. And then the last pillar is going to be about promotion, strategies for promoting. So I guess with that, a very blanket, easy statement. What is Patreon and who should be on it?
Yeah. When I talk about Patreon, right, it's talking about your sort of direct-to-fan model for building out community and exclusive content for the people who are, most into your work, to have a place to really feel that sort of deeper connection with the content while helping empowering the creator to, explore what they want to do through having like more consistent revenue on a subscription basis, right? So really it's about the ad, like many of the monetization methods out there today, whether it's ads or brand deals, are much more valuing the width of an audience as opposed to the depth of an audience. Right. And I think, as we all know, things that really like capitalize on people's passions and really they build community on, the audience members you may not be the biggest number, but those people really truly appreciate and are engaged in with the work. And I think that's really what Patreon is great at. It's great at, creating a space for those people to feel like they have a sense of community where they, can not only get access to all this cool stuff that the creator might be putting out, but also to, interact with other people who share their similar interests. Yeah, I would say like for the kinds of creators that, it is really ideal for, you'll probably hear this a lot throughout this talk, but like it really depends and it's different for every person. The great, beautiful, and sometimes difficult thing about Patreon is there truly is no like one size fits all solution or ideal kind of person or exact playbook for way to do it. Mm-hmm. Some people might say like it's most geared towards what people call always on content. If your content really doesn't take like seasonal breaks and you're able to, whatever you produce, whether it's a podcast, a video series, downloadables, whatever you have, if you are in a mode of consistent creation, then it's going to be geared towards you. But that's not to say it doesn't work for people whose, I would say, creative output is maybe less consistent. It's about then finding out like, okay, maybe you have a seasonal gap. All right, well, maybe Patreon is a great place to create content in between that gap and keep your audience engaged so they're not just waiting like months in between seasons or release or anything like that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of my broad overview.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. And it is a very flexible platform, which I think hopefully we can get into kind of some of that flexibility to, I don't want to say optimize it, but make the most of it for your audience. I think that's definitely something that some people struggle with. I know I struggle with it sometimes, but at the same time, there's a lot of people who have a lot of success. So I'd love to have that chat with you, Jesse. For somebody, let's say perhaps, or somebody in the audience tonight who does not have a Patreon,
Mm-hmm.
when should they consider establishing one? Is there kind of the best time to do that? Do you worry about maybe not having enough content going on an ongoing basis? What's kind of the parameters to when should somebody start creating or establishing a Patreon presence?
Sure. Yeah, totally. I will pull out my first of the it depends markers that I promised that I would pull out. I think it really is more dependent on what your goals are for the membership, right? I think, or when I say membership, I mean Patreon sort of membership community interchangeably. You should always be going into these things sort of knowing like what you hope to get out of it, right? Is this to like completely make it so that this is your main source of income so that you don't have to take ad deals or so that you can focus on this with 100% of your time? Is it just to give people a place who want community and to talk to each other? And you're not really tied to like this being a significant amount of money you generate, right? Is this more tied to just like you have all this extra stuff and you don't know what else to do with it, so you have to put it here, right? Each of those things in my mind sort of factors into when is the right time. I think that you have to understand that like when you're talking about the size of a Patreon after launching, right? A lot of people will go off like my total subscriber count or my whatever. You have to sort of understand that like these sort of things are inevitably geared towards the biggest fan of your work, right? So you're looking at like a portion of your audience.
Mm-hmm.
So if your focus is community, right? Determine like what you feel like is that healthy point at which, whether it's through a Discord or through like live streams or through Zooms, you feel the point at which there's enough people for there to be a dialogue, for it to sort of take on a life of its own, as opposed to just sort of sitting there quietly. For some people, that might be 5 people. For some, that might be 100 people, right? There's no like, it has to be at this number. I'm speaking about it more in terms of podcasting, but like there's ways to sort of try to game out, if you are coming at it from a revenue perspective, how many people you might expect to go into the membership. You know, these numbers are not hard and fast. Like when we talk about like conversion rates from audience to a member, people can convert anything from like 2% to like 25 to 30. It really varies per person and the type of content that you do.
Yeah.
As far as like the piece about like how much content you have, the best version of membership, the best converting usually involves some sort of exclusive piece of meaningful content. What meaningful content is really different things to different people, right? If you were to look at like the top Patreon charts, a lot of them are podcasts. Many of them are podcasts because they share a similar benefit of exclusive episodes of some kind, whether that's access to extended versions of the episode, minisodes, full bonuses, after show chat type formats, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to think then the balance there is like how much cost is this going to have to me? Like to whether you run a studio space, run an extra hour if you're really truly independent, just like time you could be spent growing your audience or doing your full-time job if you have a full-time job. It's like with the amount of money I think could come from this sort of meet up to the commitment I'm laying out for myself. But maybe you're more focused on a membership, at least to start, around stuff that's like tangential to your creation process, whether that's like the maps you create or stuff you might already have. Then, you know, your commitment of like deliverables on a month-by-month basis might be much lower than somebody else.
Yeah, and I mean, this community does have a pretty wide breadth of content creation. There's a lot of like, I'm a podcaster, but we have folks here that are map makers, folks that are writers that create adventures or subclasses or items or compendiums of things. So yeah, there's this kind of like broad, wide breadth of types of content creation. So for those of you in the audience, I'm looking to you. If you have questions that you want that are very specific to your line of business, please feel free to put them in the chat, in the RT discussions text chat. But I really appreciate that, Jesse, because it kind of comes from a place, regardless of where these content creators are coming from, when you're setting up this Patreon, I think you said it very, very eloquently. What's the objective of the Patreon? So I suppose that might be considered this first step. Like you're saying, are you focusing on community? And that might dictate the kinds of rewards you might want to include as part of the membership. If it's more about exclusive content and giving special things to the people who care the most about your products, then yeah, it makes sense that maybe they get a special exclusive map every other month or what have you. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. One last question for you, with the hat of the newbie coming into Patreon. If someone is sitting here and they're making a choice, because there's a number of different platforms that do something similar to Patreon, I'd be curious to know why you think someone should choose to use Patreon first and foremost, as opposed to some of these other platforms, and what kind of things that Patreon does that are especially good and especially well suited for creating this community of people to support your content.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are definitely a lot of options out there. I think what makes sort of Patreon unique in a lot of ways is that broadness we talked about before, in that, essentially Patreon very early on was like one of the first people to get into the space, if not the first, of like membership direct to fan communities.
Mm-hmm.
And though there's been a lot that have come about since, they usually tend to be very like specific in their focus, which I can understand. Maybe they want to like capture a specific market or something like that. But sort of what's beautiful about Patreon that it's sort of maintained is that also makes it hard to sort of optimize, I'll say, is it's built so that all sorts of people can use it. If you talk about we talk about modality is just referring to like the kind of content you create, whether that's writing, audio, video, right? And what Patreon is really good at is what we call this like multimodality creation, right? Which you have the ability to, create video content, give people these downloadable maps, write up new character cases, stories, do your live stream Q&As, do your exclusive podcasts, all under one window. It's not like I have to have a platform for this, a platform for this.
Mm-hmm.
This is really the one, what I think is important whenever you're selling any product, and a membership is a form of a product, right? Is like having a very clear and concise call to action. So like if it's hard for you to sort of consolidate everything in one place where, you can do all these different ways you want to create, then having like these multiple, like go here if you want this, but go here if you want this, but here if you want this,
Mm-hmm.
It's really confusing from an audience perspective. And it's really confusing from a creator perspective about like how you're sort of evaluating these things and talking about them. I think that's one piece of it. And then the other piece I'd say is like Patreon has been doing this since I believe I'm going to get the year wrong and somebody's going to be like, why didn't you know that better? It's like 2010, 2011, right? One of the first people to enter the membership space. And there's a lot of things you learn over a decade of running this that are small things that people don't really think about that go into like optimizing the product, like simple things you don't think about that I think a lot of platforms don't have the amount of data or experience to have implemented these things that maybe you don't even think of, right? Like, even just like blurring out bonus content as in the feed and then having a preview feature,
Mm-hmm.
Or anything simple like how your earnings are presented or how your relationship manager is formatted for you allowed to talk to, your patrons and understand why they're leaving or why they're moving. These are all things that are meant to make it like easy for you as a creator to run this membership business.
Lots of quality of life improvements.
Oh yeah, lots of them over time, and they feel like things that you're just like, oh, I expect that, but they happen over a lot of learnings and a lot of head.
Uh-huh. Absolutely.
And then the last thing is like we're solely focused on creating a product to allow independent creators to monetize their business and like create community, right? And it's like we have a lot of really exciting new features coming and are constantly working on new things to make it really that one-stop shop for any aspect of your business you would need.
Awesome. And really quickly, how long does it take to set one up? Is it a pretty straightforward process? I would imagine it is, from what I remember it was, but I'll let you give the pitch of how easy it is to set up a Patreon account.
It's a great question. It is quite easy to set up a page. That is not the difficult part in my mind. None of this has to be difficult, but the more difficult part is like figuring out your content work streams and figuring out what your value proposition is that you can realistically set up to. It used to be actually like, I think within the last 2 or 3 years, there was like even making the page was a bit more difficult. There were all these steps, all these boxes you got to fill out. We've even really simplified that process. So it's really like in an hour, you could probably make a page and get it set up with the right format, looking at other examples. That part is really clear. I think it's more solidifying your strategy ahead of time is important.
Yeah.
That's and kind of figuring out, oh, if it is around bonus content, when could I have this first piece of bonus content, which we can get into more about that. That's more about the like promotion piece though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, while we're at it, why don't we talk about that then? So, or maybe not specifically the promotion piece, but the content streams and the kind of rewards that people should be thinking about and considering. Maybe we'll start very broadly and then we can slowly narrow it down into more specifics. But I'd be curious to know, when you're creating a Patreon, what are the kinds of things, the kinds of rewards that people should start considering, and the kinds of strategies that they should already kind of have in place for their Patreon, but kind of as it goes live, things like that.
Yeah, totally. So there's a couple pieces there. Like I said earlier, it sort of depends on what your bandwidth is or what your expectations are. Some people like to start with like what I would call like a low lift version of membership, maybe because like you really don't have much time to devote to this or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I generally tend to think that's a little bit like of a mistake, because people are like, oh, I'll see what happens and then I can add more to it if people have an appetite for it. But you're never really going to know what that appetite is unless you really have some sort of strong value prop to begin with that's going to encourage those people to sign up. You're really going to capture like a small portion of your audience ever. But yeah, there's sort of two main pillars when I talk about like the ideal Patreon membership. It's like the content piece and the community piece. Community is really your sort of sticky glue piece that holds it all together, that keeps people around.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to like grow off the idea of community, because it's the kind of thing people really appreciate when they're in it, as opposed to me like talking about a community. It's very hard to like be value first with that. But those are things like a Discord server attached to your Patreon. Those are things like a weekly Zoom hangout or Q&A, or things that really make people feel involved and like they're communicating with each other. And then the other piece would be that content piece, which is really your driver of growth. That's your like show not tell benefit,
Okay.
which I think is important for really any membership to have. It's like you want to have some sort of value proposition, and content is a very clear value proposition. If I go back to podcasting as sort of like an analogy, I think podcasts don't dominate the top 100 because podcasts are magical. They dominate because there's a couple reasons. Like the serialized nature of a podcast makes it so that bonus content is a very clear value proposition. If I like 4 episodes of, Dungeons and Daddies every month, then I'm going to like a 5th episode.
Mm-hmm.
So if the Patreon is a 5th episode of this podcast, that's very easy for me to understand as an audience member what my expectations are. So I think that's always important to keep in mind, is like, are you expecting the audience to do work to figure out what they expect to get out of the membership? Or is it very clear what they expect to get out of the membership? The other way to think about that, right, is podcasts do well because they are very like oriented around a cadence. So people think about a membership in monthly terms because you pay monthly, right? So you really want to break down your benefits into like, what can I reliably create on a monthly basis where I can stick to some sort of cadence that, I can do realistically, and that the audience member can expect, all right, it's February. That means I'm going to get my 2 extra downloadable maps this month. That means I'm going to get this 3D model this month. Like those are very clear things for me to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And when I come to your Patreon page for the first time, maybe I don't have to be like, I don't know. I don't get it,
I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah. That was sort of wrapping it. It's just like, that's not a specific kind of content, because that's really different for every person, but it should sort of fit into those like general molds,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I really like your example of, if I already like this, I know what I'm getting. Being transparent like that, I think, is maybe something that I hadn't considered before. So yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. You don't want to make it harder than it has to be for the people who are going to be supporting you. So I can totally get behind that.
Like make it easy for them to both sign up and understand why they're signing up.
Yeah. And it makes me wonder, if an easy model to follow, and I'm going a little bit off on a tangent here, Jesse, but if that means that an easy model to follow is this free content model where maybe you're making a free map, or you're providing your community with free deliverables, but then you're kind of like locking behind the membership a third or fourth or fifth version of the same thing. I think that does translate pretty well to other lines within the tabletop RPG space. People could create a one-shot adventure once a month for free, and then the second one is this one that is only for their subscribers. So I like that idea a lot.
Totally, yeah. And like that's a great point that I didn't really mention. Like the whole, I generally don't recommend, like, people sometimes will ask, like, should I move everything behind Patreon and just create there? But the problem with that, right, is that Patreon is really only as valuable as like people you can direct to it. And like you said, these sort of free content you're creating are sort of your like audience capture method, where people can find, when somebody's launching like a new podcast, for example, and they want to launch a Patreon, I keep going back to podcasting, but it's just a simple analogy, and they may want to launch a Patreon around it. Usually I'll say, like, unless you have a very large audience through your socials already, like, launch the membership 3 to 4 episodes in, because you want people to understand and be attached to and see the value of the free product. And then the value proposition of the like paid version is very clear.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple other questions here related to kind of rewards and content. And I think you kind of touched a little bit on each of them. One that has always caused me a little bit of grief is the decision of how many tiers of support I should create on my Patreon. I sat there for far too long trying to think of, should there be 3 or 2 or 4, and what should the numbers be? And I hope that's not too crunchy, but I wonder if there's any method behind that you would suggest, or some of the more popular content creators on Patreon, what kind of models do they follow as it relates to these tiers of support?
Totally. Yes. I mean, there's generally like well-worn best practices, that we'll use. I think before I get into them, I think what's really important is, like, a lot of people make the mistake of saying, I want 3 tiers, now let me figure out my benefits. I think it's a much better idea to think, these are the benefits that I want to do. How many tiers make sense? A lot of people are like, I feel like I'm really reaching for this like $20 tier. Then maybe don't have it. Like, there's no reason to have a tier. I mean, some people get into the idea of, like, if you have a low and a high, then it directs people to the middle. It's like a marketing technique, I guess. I don't come from a marketing background.
Yeah, I suppose.
But I tend to disagree with that. I think simplicity and like clear value propositions are really the most important thing you can be doing. So it's more like, what do I think are real value adds that aren't like doing it for the sake of doing it, that are things I want to enjoy? And then what feels like a natural tier number for that. But overall, like, the general advice we give is like no more than 4 tiers usually. I usually say no more than 3. I've worked with a lot of creators who really enjoyed the single tier option. I wish that there was better, like, clear data we could share about, like, if you have 2 tiers, this means X% more in earnings. It's just not really the case, because truly every community is different, every creator is different. But like, usually we'll say no more than 4 tiers. I like single tier options a lot. Like, people seem to feel like they shouldn't do that, but you want to sort of, in my mind, shape your membership around, like, there's usually one thing that's like the clear benefit value proposition that is based on the kinds of work you're doing. Bonus content, like a bonus episode of the podcast, or like an extra map for your example, or something like that. And people feel like the need to throw in a lot of like filler. Like, I don't feel like there's enough here. I think a distinct value proposition and narrow down on that is better than just more,
Yeah. So being succinct and being like, this is what I'm offering, that's it, that's all, seems to be the most straightforward and kind of garner that engagement then.
Yeah, and the work of being more descriptive about what the benefit is should really go more on your promotional strategy of like the whole show not tell thing of like, we can go more into this later, but of like teasing your content in your public facing platforms that lives behind the paywall.
Okay. That's cool. And really quickly, why not more than 4? Just out of curiosity, is that just because it starts to dilute it?
Well, the reason I say 3, not 4 is silly because as the product is right now, that the 4th will go on a show more on the bottom. And I just don't like that from a
Okay.
visual standpoint of like, oh, I can't see everything. I have to click more. Like that's annoying. It's like, it's the whole idea, and this all ties into it, that like every decision you make a person make is an idea they're going to say, I'll come back to this later. Right? If they're like, oh, I can't decide between the 5 and the 10, I'll come back to it later.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
want those people to sign up when they're on the page because they might not come back to it later. Who knows?
Mhm.
And so having to click show more, having to read through 4 tiers and understand the difference in benefits if it's not clear, these are all just it's like the decision fatigue idea that like the more decisions you have to make, the less likely you are to make any decision, essentially.
Yeah.
Now, people have like specialized business models that like really gear themselves towards more tiers, and I don't think that's a mistake necessarily. But like if you're trying to apply a best practice to everybody, I would say sort of 1 to 4.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a whole lot. I mean, I even remember when I was making mine, I was like, I felt like I was stretching. So maybe I should go back and I should reevaluate that. Your advice is definitely, at the very least, going to be useful for me and the people in the audience tonight. Wonderful, wonderful. You talked a little bit about how monthly donations is kind of the de facto default. I do know that you can opt for a per creation donation versus a monthly donation position when it comes to their Patreons. Is there a fast and easy rule that you can think of that people can apply these kinds of structures to their rewards? And should they be switching back and forth? Like, oh, you know what? It's my dry time. I'm gonna take the summer off and make it a per creation and then switch back to monthly, or is that maybe ill advised? Sorry, I'm like wrapping up 3 questions in one here.
No, it makes sense. And just the one thing before I address that I would just note is like when you say monthly donations, right? It's like, and this might seem nitpicky, but I think it's important. We really try to encourage creators to not use like support or donation based wording usually when they're talking about this stuff.
Oh, interesting.
Because like like I said, you're sort of selling a product. Like this is a value for value exchange, ideally, with these benefits, right? And support or donate is more along the ideas of like, I sort of just want, this is just money to support my work. Now, I'd be lying if I wouldn't say that there's like a large portion of your audience that will do that. And that's totally what you feel comfortable with. But like, we've done a lot of studies that show a large portion of people do sign up because of that exclusive content. So leading with the value proposition, you're going to capture like support people, but also people who are there for the bonus goodies, stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's really
so usually we say like value first wording, like membership, subscription, join, exclusive content, that kind of wording usually tends to work better for people. Now on your point about the per creation versus monthly, generally like our best practices, per creation isn't really ideal for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. It's more of like I don't actually know if you can still make a per creation tier.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
But you used to be able to, and some people do who had it. It's tough. We really encourage people. The benefit of like Patreon and monthly recurring revenue is like you're able to understand what your expected revenue is, and your audience member is able to know what to expect in terms of what they pay, right? Like It's not a good experience for them, right? If you didn't create for 3 months, but then you had a really, really productive month and you made like 15 things and they got charged 15 times and they might not have been expecting that. And they might be like, what the heck?
Mm-hmm.
That's not like a great experience for them, and then you might be thinking, oh, I have all this stuff to put out, but I don't want to put it out because I don't want to charge them too much this month or whatever. Whereas like, we really encourage people to get into the mindset of like monthly benefits you can commit to, or some sort of cadence benefits you can commit to.
I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense. And it makes it more consistent, reliable as far as an income stream goes for a creator. I suppose the impetus behind that question was because it's happened to me where my podcast is my hobby / side hustle, if you want to call it that. And I felt bad personally when I went on break and I was like, you know what? I'm not going to be able to create content right now. I'm having a baby or something. In those instances, do you feel like pausing it altogether is the right call, or just being open with your community saying, look, it's going to be quiet for the next couple months, but I'm going to pick back up again later? Like, do you have any advice for that kind of situation?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question and like totally fair. Like that is something that, life
Yeah.
happens, like, essentially, right? Like anybody. And being like, you are going to just make this forever, no breaks allowed, right? Is like both scary and unrealistic for most people. I think the most important part about it is communication, right? Like I have seen people pause billing, like that's pretty easy to do, pause and unpause a membership
Okay. Yeah.
around it. But like the only times I think that people have been like, what the heck from a member perspective or a patron perspective is when the creator like wasn't communicating,
Mm-hmm.
you know? I think I've very rarely, if ever, seen a creator be like, hey, really, like I'm traveling, I have the kid coming or whatever, like I'm gonna be less consistent. If you wanna like cancel and then re-sign up, I totally understand. Or I'm gonna pause billing for now. Like as long as you have that communication, most people that in my experience are gonna be like, that's totally understandable. Like I completely
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Cool. And I mean, speaking of communication and like posting on the Patreon for the community and things like that, it's been a struggle for me to decide whether or not I should treat the Patreon posts as its own platform, or do I just use the Discord server, or like when and what should be posted on the Patreon page
Mm.
for the Patreon creators, as opposed to other community social media spaces that you might be using as a content creator?
It's a great question. Do you mean content related to the membership or just content in general?
Just in general. I mean, or related to the membership. I leave it up to your expertise to which one would be the most valuable for people listening.
I think that like you want to so yeah, a lot of people like will post all their content on the Patreon that they
Yeah.
post everywhere else in addition to the bonus. I think the best method is focus the Patreon like news feed on meaningful pieces of content that are exclusive to the Patreon that you're not posting anywhere else.
Okay.
Like your bonus episode, bonus map downloads, stuff like that. Like you want like that focused on when I get a notification as a member that you posted something new, it should be like one of the benefits I expect as part of the exclusive membership that I'm not posting elsewhere.
Yeah.
Because it's only as valuable as the Patreon is only as valuable to some, certainly, as the exclusivity of the content that you put there. That being said, if you have a Discord integration through Patreon and you want to use that as a like way to run some exclusives, like say you do a book club, for example, right? And you want to do your chapter discussions on a voice in Discord, I would like tell people you're doing that in the newsfeed as like an update post. But a lot of that stuff you could potentially run through the Patreon only Discord if you're using that in a way to facilitate like community related projects and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That makes a whole lot of sense. Make it part of the value added. That makes a whole lot of sense. I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure we save time for questions from the community. And I still want to talk about promotion. So maybe we'll jump into promotion.
Sure.
So Jesse, you touched on it a little bit with regards to promotion. Maybe we'll start again broad and maybe narrow it down a little bit. But in general, do you have any recommendations or best practices that pertain to promoting a Patreon? Are there certain platforms or certain methods that you recommend and you find to be especially good at finding new supporters or new members, I suppose we should say, for people's Patreons?
Yes. I think, okay, so the first rule is make it easy for people to find your Patreon. Some people like do not do that very well. And in my opinion, that's just like, it's not like you have to shout it out at people every minute, but have it in your bio or have it in your link tree, or if you have a YouTube channel, have it, the badge be there, like anyway, so that it's not hard for people to know you have a page. Nobody should ever be surprised, essentially, that you have this membership. Like people will generally not look that hard to find it if you haven't made it easy for them to find. I think that's the first rule of promotion. Second is the other really important piece, right, is the most effective driver of growth of a membership, pretty much bar none, is teasing your exclusive content in your public channels. So wherever you've built your audience, an email list, a podcast, a YouTube channel, a Twitter, an Instagram, find ways to show the value of the content that for the membership in organic ways.
Mm.
This could be anything from like in podcasting, you clip 30 seconds of your podcast, throw that up on your Instagram, or actually put that episode in your RSS feed of your podcast so it shows like Patreon preview, 30 seconds. For the full episode, go more. Or if you like make, visuals, like a little clip about the process of you making the visual, perhaps that you could like throw onto Instagram or TikTok or Twitter or anything like that. Find ways to like have a value first messaging where you're showing pieces of the content but not the whole thing, and directing them like to get more on Patreon
Mm-hmm.
is going to be your most effective method. And that could even be like, maybe it's like people tweet out, like maybe you do commission work, for example, for people's like character art or something like that. Somebody tweets at you like, hey, I love this character art I got from your Patreon. Retweet that and show it out. That's like a great reminder to people that, oh, I have a Patreon.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these things I sort of call like soft marketing. These are all ways for you to talk about a Patreon organically without being like, here's a mid-roll ad for my Patreon. Shout outs are a great example of that. Shout outs might not be the best value proposition. They might not get you a million people, but it's going to be a good reminder to people that you have a Patreon.
Yeah.
Without you having to feel like you read a mid-roll ad for your Patreon.
I've never thought of it that way, but you're 100% right. You're giving those people recognition and also reminding everybody else that, hey, this exists. That's really smart.
I think that's the big one, is like teasing the content and finding ways to organically mention it to your audience where they live already,
Mm-hmm.
And that's different based on the medium that you make. But like, I always encourage people to think about like, okay, what's the first time you signed up for a Patreon? What got you there? What got you there the first time? And it's very interesting to hear. It's like, oh, maybe they published 3 videos and they said they were publishing the 4th next week, but it was on Patreon. And I wanted to watch that day. It's like, think about what drives you to do something. And then that should sort of inform your strategy.
Yeah, that's really clever, especially because some of these, they're pretty niche content creation pillars, I suppose you could say. So absolutely, if you signed up for a friend's map making Patreon, what pushed you to do that? Was it the community aspect? Was it you needed the map to be to have an overlay of rain because you really wanted to run an encounter in the rain, and there was a rain overlay just for Patreons or something like that? Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. As far as the kind of growth people can expect, is there kind of like a cadence, or are there times where a Patreon's growth might stagnate and it would, we would want to encourage more promotion, or should the promotional strategy always kind of be the same throughout the life cycle of your content? I guess I'm thinking of like, what are those called? Where there's like thresholds where you're like, oh, at this point we're going to push really hard because the Kickstarter's coming out, or so in other spheres, people might be pushing promotion in a certain cadence. Does that kind of cadence apply to a Patreon, or is it different altogether?
I think a decent example of like maybe like what I've seen is like people are doing a live show and like they do pre-sale tickets for their live show through Patreon, which is a great promotional technique. Like that is like super easy to pull off. I mean, not many people are not doing live shows or at the point where they're going to, but like usually it should be a consistent cadence. It's not like you can tie it to things, but there's like with a Kickstarter, there's the launch moment, and there should be a launch moment for Patreons where you're really making a big deal of like the launch of this thing.
Yeah.
But Patreon sort of go like a consistent cadence of promotion, I think, is the most important thing. Like not feeling like these things grow over time. The amount of growth you can expect to get is really a factor of like how big your public audience grows, because only as many people can sign up as people you direct there, right? But like,
absolutely, yeah.
You can expect growth over time. Is the two will grow together, and the more consistently you mention something in just like a regular cadence, the more growth you can expect to see.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as far as a promotion goes, are there third-party tools or even tools built in to Patreon that you would want to shout out here as ways to help get your promotion out, whether that be like administrative tools or other kind of support functions that you can think of that would be useful for a creator to know? Like, oh yeah, there's this one feature in Patreon that nobody seems to know about. They should be using this more, or there's this one bot that you can add to your, I don't know, your Discord server that does this to help promote your Patreon, things like this.
I think there's some stuff coming down the road this year, honestly, that will help with some of that, like around clipping and previews. I think like there's no magic bullet really. It's like I said, it's making it easy. Like if you're an Instagram creator, have Patreon as a highlight there, for example, or and on Instagram stories, you can do like swipe up. That'll take you directly to the Patreon, for example. YouTube, like you can have your badge over there. I wouldn't say like there's any sort of magic bullet right now as far as like third-party tools you could use. It's about just like effectively directing people from the platforms where you do have a communication outlet with them.
Cool. Awesome. I had a few other little things in my notes, but we have 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we touch on some questions from the people that are here listening live. We've got a question here from Adam. Do people find audiences through Patreon itself, or do existing audiences grow through Patreon once one becomes a member? Or does the audience mainly grow through other social media with people then coming to Patreon? How does that work?
Yeah, it's really the latter, which is audiences grow elsewhere and then move over to Patreon. There's been a lot of discussion around like discoverability, right? And Patreon isn't like a discovery platform. People generally will not find you. People aren't searching for people to, sign up for their Patreon. It's really about direct call to actions right now. So think about however you grow audience, whether it's your email list, your website, your Twitter, your Instagram, your YouTube, your podcast, whatever. Those are really your tools to then drive that's where you grow your audience of some very big fans, some medium fans, I'll listen to this once in a while, and trying to sort of like move them over to the Patreon. So they sort of grow in tandem with your public channels and your Patreon.
Awesome. Hope that answers your question, Adam. If it doesn't, let me know. There's a couple questions relating to the per creation system. One example here from Bearworks talks about how many people who are on the per creation model suffer from a common occurrence of dine and dash pledges, where a person pledges, downloads all the content in under, say, an hour, and then unpledges right away after that. For these people who don't make, and like you make no money, there's no transaction that happens. Is there kind of any update or any plans to fix this model that you're aware of?
It's a great question. That's so frustrating, I'm sure, and like a lot of people I talk to when they're setting up their Patreon, it's like something that we definitely always want to be wary of, that like you don't want to really make it so that people can sign up, get everything they want, and then dip out the next day. And with per creation, I could assume that could be even more frustrating because you didn't even get that charge for the first month. That's great feedback, actually, that I'll send over to the product team. I don't know if, like I said, we really encourage most people to go with like a monthly creation cadence as opposed to a per creation cadence. I think there's some ways to sort of like combat that, but I wouldn't call them sort of product optimized, like so easy to do. Like maybe you only have certain things available on a rolling basis. You delete posts after a certain amount of time, so only your last like 4 are up. And then if a patron wants something that was there for a while ago, you can easily verify they've been for 3 years. You can send them it over if you find it available anymore. That's sort of what I would call non-optimal approach. But you're always going to have people who dine and dash, as it was. So it's more about formatting your benefits. And when I go back to the monthly thing, it could work for per creation. It's like this is more about like, yes, what's on there is great, but you can expect more in the future, and that's what you're sticking around for, because you're always gonna have some people who dip in and dip out, But it's about formatting the membership in a way to encourage them to stick around.
Cool, that makes sense. I hope that answers the questions that folks had about that. I know there's a few people in the discussion chat who were talking about this particular complaint. So I hope that answers it. There's another question here from Puffy. Are there methods of researching if an audience is interested in a product? So do you have any tools at your disposal that you can share about that?
That's a great question. And I really didn't touch on this earlier, but it's something I really suggest anybody does when making a Patreon, which is finding out what people actually want. It's like a lot of people are like, I think they might want this. And what I'll say is ask them. ask them what they want. And we're working on some tools right now that are really cool that are just like entering like sort of an experiment we're running right now, which is like almost like a wait list for people's memberships, where maybe in the future you might be able to do things like poll your audience. But if you're talking pre-launch, usually what I'll recommend, pre-launching your membership at all, usually what I'll encourage people to do is like wherever your dialogue is with your audience, find ways to ask them about it there. If you have a podcast, like say, I'm thinking about making a Patreon.
Mm-hmm.
These are the kinds of things I want to do. I'd love to hear from you all. Send me an email if you like that or if you want to do something else. If you have a YouTube page, on your community tab, you can run a poll to say, hey, these are the 5 benefits I'm thinking about doing. Like, would you be interested in this? Feel free to suggest others in the comments.
Yeah.
Wherever your dialogue is, I will say, if you want to do this, which I think is a good idea, encourage involving your audience in that. Because like if they feel like you're building for them, they're more likely to sign up for it. And you're going to end up doing things that people actually want versus what you think people might want. And the two things sometimes match up, oftentimes, sometimes don't.
Yeah. Fielding the people that are listening or consuming your content already. I know that recently Spotify podcasts allow you to do that too, where you can poll your listeners. So, I mean, the people that are going to be answering these polls are hopefully the people that have enough interest in your content. They're going to be the ones.
Exactly.
Yeah. They're the ones that are going to be contributing to a Patreon and, signing up for that membership. Adam had another question with regard, and sorry, Jesse, I'm like firing them off at you super quick. I hope that's okay.
Love it.
Adam asks, what's new and coming down the pipeline with Patreon? What can current and future members look forward to down the road? And obviously, you might not be able to share things, but if you can, what are some things that people can look forward to with regards to new features?
I'm really not sure. I'm not sure what of this I can share. So I'm going to err on the side of caution. But I can share that within the next 4 months, there are going to be some very exciting announcements for some pretty cool new ways that you can use Patreon that I think will open up a lot more options for creators and how they use the platform. I wish I could get more into specifics there, but unfortunately I can't.
That's fair. No worries. We don't want to get you in trouble.
And I gotta say is these are all centered around the idea of like our goal over the next 5 to 10 years are really to give creators the options to like run their creative business in any way they want. And this is all sort of in service of that. It's like make it so that no matter how you're creating, you have and how often you create and like who your audience is, you have the options to sort of run your business through Patreon, how it makes sense for you. I think there's a lot of like simple features that have rolled out recently that are really great, like our native video player. So you can now upload video directly onto Patreon as opposed to run it through Vimeo or YouTube Unlisted or something like that.
Cool.
Have made some updates to like our podcast player, and there's some plan there, as well as like some ideas around, all sorts of stuff. I would say you'll see some more news, and I'll be hopefully able to talk more about that in a couple months.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we'll look forward to that. One last question we got from Anominium at the beginning of the chat. So Anominium, I hope we answered some of. I'm going to skip parts of your question because I feel like we talked about that as the discussion went on. But you do talk specifically about people who are purely digital. And one particular thing that you ask about is, Jesse, would you recommend early access for content? Does early access to something that then gets unlocked later for the general public, does that work as a reward system as it relates to a Patreon?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think yes, if it makes sense for you. It's very variable how impactful that is perceived to be by your audience. I think that early access for many can sort of be like table stakes, if you will, like something that isn't a huge selling point for them.
Mm-hmm.
While for others, it can be immensely impactful. I tend to think a lot of the time it's not the most value first thing. But then, like I mentioned an example earlier that was a real story that somebody said why they signed up was because they watched 3 of a 4-part series, and then the 4th part you could watch that day on Patreon, and that got them to sign up right there.
Mm-hmm.
And this was for like something with a lot of hype, and it was like, you need to see this next thing now. All right, I have to have it now, But I think that's more the exception, that's like really a reason Although, I would say that like people who write web fiction, like who write serialized novels on platforms like Royal Road or Tapas.io or something like that, do really well with like chapters in advance of their public facing
Yeah.
stuff. So they might have chapters 34 public, but up to chapter 40 is, on Patreon. That tends to work really well for people, and that's actually like the sort of basis for a lot of their memberships. So yeah, I would say it can work.
Okay, yeah. So if that hype is there, if people are waiting for it, then yes. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. If they're like, oh my God, I cannot wait for this,
Yeah.
it can work.
Cool, cool. Well, I hope, audience, that I got all of your questions in. I tried my best. But I'm looking at the time and we're basically at the end. So, Jesse, I wanted to thank you for being here to talk to us about Patreon and how people can use Patreon to kind of connect to their community and make money off of the stuff that they're making on a regular basis. So today we covered things that are for new Patreon users. We talked about advice on rewards and content, and then we talked a little bit about some strategies for promotion. Jesse, before we sign off and say goodbye, did you have any parting words or wisdom that you didn't get the opportunity to share that you'd like to share? And can you also remind folks where, if they have questions or they want to reach out or follow you, where could they do that?
Totally. I think, they're like I've said this a lot. I think truly it is beautiful of Patreon that there's no one size fits all. I would hope nobody would feel encouraged by any of the things that discouraged by any of the things I said that maybe they're not ready yet, right? There's really no like, although people have different goals, like for a lot of people, just jumping in, having that deeper connection with your community and sort of figuring it out as it goes is completely valid. So, really it truly is different for everybody. And never try to compare yourself to anybody else with something like a Patreon, because how everybody creates and everything like that is completely different for everybody. But, I truly believe, as somebody who's worked at a lot of different places on the media ecosystem, that like it's really amazing, to hear what people can do with the strength of their community. And that Patreon really, from everything I've seen, everybody here is passionate about creativity and about empowering people who do all sorts of stuff to do what they love. So yeah, I'd say I would encourage anybody who's interested to actually join the Patreon Discord server. We have a community Discord server that's filled with thousands of creators like yourself who are constantly giving advice to each other, talking to each other about, how to use the platform, how to best do all sorts of other stuff. It's a great place to be. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a great place. And then if anybody wants to ever get in touch with me, my email is jadler@patreon.com. Happy to answer any questions or anything like that.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for all this wonderful advice, Jesse. And people in the chat and the Discord, the discussion chat, are saying all kinds of wonderful things about the chat. So that, we appreciate all of the advice and the recommendations and kind of the tidbits of knowledge. So I guess with that, I'll remind folks that, you can listen to this conversation again when it comes out in podcast form. You can share it with your other creators and make sure that they can benefit from Jesse's wisdom. And that's it. So I'm Matt of Roleplay Chat, and this has been another RT Talks. I hope it's been super useful. The next event, sorry, I'm blanking. It was a chat about accessibility. So I know that's coming up in the month of April and how to make your content more accessible. So look forward to that. Thank you, Jesse. This has been another RT Talks, and we'll sign off. Bye, everybody.